Karl Marx was one of the most influential philosophical figures of the 19th century, known best for his dense but theoretically compelling work Capital, a critique of political economy. However, one work he authored in his lifetime that sees less discussion is Grundrisse, an unfinished manuscript written over a brief period of time from 1857 to 1858. In this work, among many other things, Marx defines a concept known as annihilation of space by time, essentially the invention of technology that significantly erases, though not completely eradicates, the space and time between places and experiences. Trains were the most common example of his time, high-speed machines that could carry their passengers across long distances and thus eliminate their perceived existence to their passengers. When one travels through the country in a train, the country no longer has any material bearing on them. It becomes solely a transitory space that they pass through quickly to get to their destination. This has only accelerated as time has gone on. The invention of the telephone allows one to hear people from any distance, photographs allowing one to see expanses from millions of miles away, and the internet transporting one into digital spaces of human conventions, stretching out and contorting the concept of space-time to be ever smaller and ever compressed. The idea of space-time compression in this more modern sense is derived from David Harvey's 1989 book, The Condition of Postmodernity. To quote his own words, the whole world's cuisine is now assembled in one place in almost exactly the same way that the world's geographical complexity is nightly reduced to a series of static images on a television screen. This is even prior to discussion of the internet's influence on these concepts. In short, space-time compression is how the technological innovation created by the expansion of capital affects the human perception of space and time, and in turn, space and time themselves. These concepts are all very interesting in their own right, but what do any of them have to do with a blockbuster Japanese role-playing video game ostensibly written and made for teenagers released in 1999? Well, as it turns out, nearly everything within Square Enix's Final Fantasy VIII as a narrative centers around Marxist discourse of space-time compression, from its basic plot events to its game mechanics to its set dressing and aestheticism. This text would be remiss not to mention that time compression itself is also simply mentioned throughout the prose of Final Fantasy VIII, though not explicitly discussed within the game's script as a Marxist concept it is, and rather rationalized as a magical affair as part of the game's internal fantasy. Regardless, it's a world defined by accelerated time and liminality, and that's reflected in the plot's unrelenting pace, the distortion of traditional mechanics in Japanese role-playing video games, and the presence of technology that compress both space and time as major parts of its setting and design. All of these pieces come together to make the ultimate reflection of compressed time, a piece that lives and breathes the Marxist discourse that inspired it in the time period it was created in. Final Fantasy VIII was developed during the time that the internet began to become more and more widely accessible, and much like contemporary works in the medium like Grasshopper Manufacture's 1999 cult classic The Silver Case, or even outside the medium such as Irwin Winkler's 1995 film The Net, this deeply reflects within the text. To begin this discussion of Final Fantasy VIII's time compression, one has to start with the obvious, the structure of the plot of the game. Not only is time compression, as mentioned before, a tangible diegetic plot point discussed within the text of the game, it's also reflected in everything about the narrative structure. To attempt to summarize Final Fantasy VIII for context would illuminate this work's point for itself. The game's events so slapdash and sporadic on a surface level that the time compression is evident. Plot twists come out of nowhere and then are never meaningfully used for anything plot-wise again, their relevance turned into their relevance. Our main protagonist, Squall, finds out that the main villain at this point in the narrative is married to his mentor. The school that all of the main characters attend is run by a monster who lived in secret underground. A race of lion creatures, symbolically tied to Squall, were actually taught to speak English by Squall's father, who Squall doesn't know is his father, but visits psychically within dreams due to the intervention of his half-sister. It's hard to keep up with and inane. And that's exactly the idea. The game's entire plot exists as a railroad of constant revelations, a roller coaster of overwhelming ideas that recontextualize and recondition the player to view things diegetically in ways that are largely meaninglessly different. What does it mean that all of the main characters came from the same orphanage and then subsequently lost their memories due to the trauma of being child soldiers? Not much within the internal fiction of the story. The characters' relationships to one another aren't meaningfully impacted by this. These ideas are meant to overwhelm the player and make them too feel constantly rushed and compressed by time. There are no real moments of quiet in Final Fantasy VIII, no moments of reprieve from the game's overarching plot. The only instance of this in the text is when Squall and his love interest Rinoa share a single second in space together, away from all the context that compressed them at all instances. "I don't want the future," Renoa says in this scene. "I want the present to stand still. I want to stay here with you." The entire game, then, is an extension of this desire. The true puppet master behind the scenes of the game's events is an evil sorceress from the future who is literally attempting to compress all of time into a single moment, a single infinity. Acceleration toward the future, and all the relentless ways the plot continues to barrel toward it, is a terrifying reality for the main cast, and a terrifying reality for ourselves as well, in an era where we can be reached at any moment and are expected to always be working because of that, a world where everyone grows up and loses who they are to the endless march of capital. The gameplay of Final Fantasy VIII is a different beast than the games that preceded it in many ways, atypical to the dopamine-fixated linear progression that codified JRPGs since their inception with Chunsoft's Dragon Quest in 1986. Most JRPGs pull from tabletop role-playing games and their mechanical construction, employing a continuous upward progression where the player's personal statistics and strength always climb, a never-ending power fantasy. While often compelling in a simple way, it's also incredibly rote at this point. It's the unfortunate state of the medium for mechanics and systems to largely be relegated to player power fantasy. Final Fantasy VIII, on the other hand, has a strange horizontally based progression system. Squall and his party do gain levels traditionally, but this only makes the game more difficult as the adversaries the party faces scale and level with them. The mode of dealing with challenges, then, is the junction and draw system. These are a complex set of mechanics, wherein the player's power is obtained from a finite number of spells that can only be taken from the enemies that you encounter throughout and then lost when cast as magic. Not only is the player not the source of power in the game, it's a power that fluctuates and wanes, ebbs and flows as opposed to a consistent positive momentum. One of the ways to progress that power even involves playing a seemingly tertiary yet deeply involved card game which brings one immense reward. The simplest and most obvious way to play the game is to draw the maximum amount of spells from every single enemy. This is not very fun or interesting, only a repetitive waste of the player's time, and this is by design. By engaging in this behavior, refusing to acknowledge the game as anything more than an artifice to optimize, the player is doing just what the main villain does as well. Compressing time. There is no drawback to drawing spells other than wasting one's own time, other than infinitely drawing out a single conflict to a standstill. The self is subject to alteration by time, and time itself is subject to alteration by the self, a perceived and material dichotomy between opposing forces. Time compression is what the endless sprawl of capital desires for its expansion, but is an unsatisfying and barren existence, and that's expertly reflected here through the conundrum of the draw mechanic and its relationship to player efficiency and player enjoyment. The context and setting of the game are arguably the most outwardly damning pieces of evidence towards the conclusion that it is a grand thesis on the ways in which time compression affects us and our lives. The internet and transportation make up big parts of the game's aesthetic language. A significant portion of the game's opening hours take place on trains between locations, a classical depiction of Marx's idea of space-time annihilation. However, Harvey's time compression is further represented through the world's reliance on the internet. Since radio waves haven't been used in 17 years, all communication is done through the internet. This interfaces with the player experience as well. There's a computer that the player can access at nearly any point in the game, which contains a vast swath of context and further interactions that further texture the rest of the work. The world is the internet, and the internet is the world. The digital spaces that show the player images and events from anywhere in the given universe compress everything into a single place, an artificial reality with and behind a screen. Our world, and conversely that of Final Fantasy VIII, feels smaller because of this. Everywhere and everyone can be accessed within a moment at a single terminal screen, and for a full understanding of the game's context, they must be. Karl Marx could not have predicted the invention of the internet when he wrote his prescient piece on space-time annihilation within those unpublished manuscripts. However, his theory lines up perfectly with the acceleration and compression of space-time that would occur over the next few hundred years with technology that theorists of his day couldn't have ever dreamed of. From the internet to the cell phone, we are constantly at every point in space and time, never existing in the present for too long. Final Fantasy VIII conveys these ideas successfully through its frenetic and unrelenting narrative structure, its postmodern and incredible battle system, and through the material conditions of its setting. Despite being a work authored for an audience that almost certainly wouldn't understand the ideas it was conveying, it still expertly conveys them, a hidden flower within the desert wasteland of compressed time. Final Fantasy VIII serves its role as one of the few truly Marxist video games. This has been Arcade Everlasting, and could you tell that this was a reworked paper which was rejected? Thank you for watching.